Oh, gotcha.
Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited at the Center for Labor and Community Studies at UM-Dearborn is able to present this information. It's very timely, it's very important. It's and I'm really grateful to all of our panelists for making the time to come here, all on their own time, all volunteer for free, because they care about getting this information out to the people who need it. So I wanted to quickly, my name is Michelle Fecto. I'm the director of the center. Rory Wickham is here as well from the center and is doing sort of the back room work on the Zoom. It's our communication specialist. Ghana Goodwin Dye, who is our conference coordinator, is also here. I want to recognize her. I also want to recognize Terrence Martin and wanted to invite, if you wanted to say a couple of words, Terrence.
No, good morning, Michelle, and thank you for having us here today. I know that there's a wealth of information to share today about issues that we certainly care about, and just happy to have such a good turnout this morning to hear this great information. So I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle, and hello to all the AFT Michigan family folks who are on the call this morning. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Terrence is the new president of the AFT Michigan, but longtime president of Detroit Federation of Teachers. And there's so many people here I'd like to recognize, but just know I think you're all important. So I wanted to quickly go over the agenda before we get started. And let me see if I can pull that up. Share screen. I believe this is the agenda. Share. If it's not, it could be an old phone bill. Okay. So as you can see, we got it pretty well chunked out. There is going to be some overlap, and our panelists may speak even though they're not in their segmented time. But we're going to start with Olivia Ponte. Olivia Ponte is oh shoot, you can see this. Can you all see what I'm doing here? Yeah, there it goes. So Olivia Ponte is a legislative analyst with the Michigan Department of Education. She works with Cheryl Kennedy in that office, and will be giving us an overview of the legislation that's been coming down this year, particularly this fall, and kind of running us through. There'll be some opportunity for Q&A. And she has a PowerPoint to share on that. The focus is going to be on those pieces of legislation that affect public school employees. We then will hear from Representative Regina Weiss, who is a sponsor of many of the bills that overturned some of the legislation of the past that took away rights and benefits of teachers. So Representative Weiss will be speaking to that, as will Daenzer, who is the Chief of Staff for Senator Dayna Polehanki. He will also be speaking about the new bills on teacher evaluation that are in the works right now, and things that are coming down the pike, maybe if not this year, then next year. And we'll also be taking Q&A at the end of their presentations. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some union staff people who are very knowledgeable about how the new legislation interacts with either labor law or contract provisions. We have Nate Walker from the American Federation of Teachers Michigan. He's an attorney and a former teacher and a former organizer with AFT. And Tammy Daenzer, who is the MEA lobbyist, who's incredibly knowledgeable and been very involved with the teacher evaluation piece. And she is a former teacher as well, and active in her school as an officer with MEA, and then that's now works for MEA statewide. So that is a quick down and dirty summary. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I am going to hand it off to Olivia.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. And I am going to try to share my screen. All right, are we seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Olivia Ponte, and I'm the legislative analyst at the Michigan Department of Education. And I am so happy to get to speak with all of you today about some of the amazing new laws and budget items that will have a positive impact on educators like yourselves. So, there we go. So the governor has signed a lot of great bills in these past 10 months of the legislative session. But there are 9 bills that specifically affect teachers and public school employees that I'd like to highlight. Note that the bills that are starred received immediate effect. So what this means is that they received 2/3 of the majority vote and they were going through the legislature, allowing them to take effect as soon as the governor signed them. The rest of the bills will take effect 90 days after the legislature adjourns. This is called sine die. We're expecting that to be pretty soon, so that some of the other bills affecting the presidential primary can take effect when that needs to happen in February. So thinking we're going to wrap up in the next few weeks or so, but the rest of those bills will take effect 90 days after that date. So as I said, these are the bills that I'm going to dig into a little bit on my later slides. But before I do that, I also think it's important to recognize some of the other new education legislation and other new initiatives that were enacted by the budget that also have an impact on teachers that you might not think about immediately. So one thing to remember is that legislation that positively affects children often positively affects staff as well. So with that being said, our state superintendent, Dr. Weiss, shared a legislative agenda of all the things that we wanted to see happen back in January with the State Board of Education, the governor, and all state legislators. And this agenda was heavily guided by this top 10 strategic education plan, which was adopted by the state board in August of 2020. And at this point, I should note that our amazing host of this event, Michelle Fecto, was serving as a board member at that time, as well as another familiar face I see on the screen, Dr. Cassandra Ulbrich, who was serving as board president. Now, while a lot of the policy items that were advocated for in that letter are coming to fruition, there's also a lot of great budget line items for educators as well. So I'm going to go through those bills, those budget line items, and then go back to those 9 bills that I highlighted in the beginning. So to that point, here are some of the other noteworthy education bills that we might not think of. So first is Senate Bill 12, and this repealed the required retention of 3rd graders not reading at grade level according to their M-STEP scores. And of course, at first glance, you're like, oh, well, this affects 3rd graders. But as many of you have probably experienced, while this law was well-intentioned, too much time was spent on these waivers trying to justify why individual students shouldn't be retained at the expense of teachers spending their time actually improving the reading of these kids. So time given back to educators with this one. Next, similarly, House Bill 4166, this repealed the A through F accountability system. This was the 2nd school accountability system in the state, which led to duplicating work as opposed to helping kids. And lastly, the legislature passed 4 major common sense gun safety laws, including the safe storage of firearms, tax exemptions for firearm safety devices, universal background checks, and extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. And Dr. Weiss and Dr. Pugh, who's the current state board president, testified in committee in support of these bills because all these common sense gun reform laws, such as these 4 that you see on the screen, are also going to help keep our classrooms safer and teachers safer. So moving on, there are 4 line items in the budget that I'd like to highlight here. The school aid budget was a legendary budget this year, and it will have a huge impact on educators and students alike. As each line item appropriation also has policy that goes along with it. But there's 4 amazing new initiatives this year that really highlight the importance of our educators and the importance of recruitment and retention efforts. So first is the new mentoring and induction grants. This is at $50 million over 5 years. And this funding is to support and retain new teachers, counselors, and administrators to really help improve their instructional practices. So allowable expenses can include stipends for training mentors, books, materials, professional learning, and other resources for this mentoring, as well as the staffing costs to cover time spent by both mentors and mentees, as this is outside their regular job duties. So we're really excited to see that and support educators, both new and old, on the mentor and mentee side. Next, there's also funding in 27I to pilot a rural educator credentialing hub. And this will support prospective educators through certifications and career experiences in our rural areas. So not as much with our veteran educators like yourselves, but still it's important to recognize the different recruitment efforts we've got going on. Next is a big pot of money. In the Section 27K, this is funding to repay student loans of employees who work directly with students. It's important to note here that the payments for this money will be the lesser of the actual student loan payment, or $200 per month. It could be up to $400 if the employee works in a district where 85% or more of the students are economically disadvantaged. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Section 27L. This provides equal per pupil payments that just goes right in your the district's state aid payment, I should say, but it must be put directly towards teacher pay. So whether this is a bonus or a blanket increase in salary, this $63.8 million is going directly in the pockets of teachers. So really excited to see these in the school aid budget this year. All right, so moving on to those 9 bills that will directly impact educators in the workplace. First, we have Senate Bill 359. So previously, teachers hired only after 2019 in DPSCD did not have the ability to collectively bargain compensation. Their wages were based solely on student performance. And this law was enacted after the restructuring of Detroit Public Schools into Detroit Public Schools Community District after the financial issues in the city and the district. But we're happy to see PA 112 now restores the rights of all teachers in DPSCD to collectively bargain their wages. And this just brings them in line with every other teacher in every other district of the state. And as we can see, this one did get immediate effect. So that was a very positive bill going through. Next, we have the big one, and this is House Bill 4354, which is probably one of the biggest labor bills we saw this year, and what a lot of my colleagues on the line are going to talk about as well. And I hope she is joined, but we should be fortunate enough to have the bill sponsor herself, Representative Regina Weiss, on the panel today, who I know has some personal experience, especially with teacher placement and these bills. So I won't steal her thunder. I'll let her share her story and expand on this and the next bill, which also talks about the prohibited subjects. But I will highlight briefly that what this bill does is put teacher placement, performance evaluations, discipline policies, classroom observations, and personnel decisions back on the bargaining table during contract negotiations. So this is really kind of just to level the playing field between management and labor here. Next, we have House Bill 4356. Again, this is another prohibited subjects bill, and this one puts back on the table discussions about contracting for non-instructional support services. So we're thinking parapros here. All right, next we have House Bill 4044, or PA 113. So after a contract ended, all step increases stopped and benefits had to remain covered at the same rate, even when these insurance prices increased, meaning that when a contract was in this limbo negotiation period, it was the teachers who were paying a lot of money out of pocket to cover benefits. And obviously this tilted the bargaining scales quite a bit as the burden to settle this contract was placed on the teachers, since the teachers are the ones whose salaries and benefits were essentially frozen in place. So this new law repeals that section and required employers to do this in the first place. And now to ensure compliance with good faith bargaining, employers can adhere to the step increases that were present in the old contract, as well as cover benefits at their increased rate. Next, we have House Bill 4233. So this new law will now allow for union dues or service fees to be collected right out of the teacher's paycheck. This makes things a lot easier, streamlines the process. Before, this was prohibited, as it was thought that a union is the separate entity and that we shouldn't use public school resources to support something like this. But the truth of the matter is that employers often offer other payroll deduction plans, such as those for insurance premiums or charitable contributions. So the administrative burden that we're going to see on schools should be negligible, but the burden on teachers will be lessened greatly. All right, moving on, we have House Bill 4820. So this one deals with seniority, and there's a little bit of a nuance here. So before, school boards couldn't have a policy where seniority was the determining factor. So the primary factor for any personnel decision. And what this new law does is allows a school board to have a seniority, a policy with seniority being the primary factor. It just can't be the only factor. So we also need to look at effectiveness or other skills and specialized training. So where we see this really coming into play is that if there's a tie between two teachers being considered for a position or a layoff, seniority will be allowed to be the tiebreaker in this instance. Also included in this law is the requirement that school boards have clear and transparent procedures for all personnel decisions, allowing all relevant factors to be included. All right, next we have another one that did get immediate effect, and this is something that we are really excited about. So what this does is it allows school employees to come back to work immediately after retiring without adversely affecting their pension or retirement benefits. So before, there was this 9-month wait out period where educators or any school employee could not make a single dime working in a school after their retirement. So now you can come back to work immediately with a $15,000 salary cap. Now it's important to note this cap is per calendar year. So you could start working at the beginning of the school year and you'll have this cap September through December. And then it restarts in January with the new calendar year. And then furthermore, this cap is only relevant for 6 months. After that 6 months, you can have unlimited earnings from the school. So this is really a bridge into your unlimited earnings as opposed to having to wait out and earn nothing. During this 6-month period, you can return to work as a sub, a bus driver, a coach, really anything at the school other than superintendent. However, to make sure that this doesn't hurt the retirement system in any unintended way, this law will sunset in 5 years. So this means it will end 5 years from now. And at that time, we will have to revisit this idea again. And if this became something that really helped our educator workforce, did not adversely affect the retirement system, then we can pursue another legislative change at that time. So the last bill, or bills, I should say, that I'd like to highlight really quickly is mostly for our out-of-state educators, but I do want to make sure that we're all aware of this new change so that we can properly communicate to our out-of-state teacher friends. So before, any out-of-state teacher candidate for licensure had to take the MTTC, whether they had just gotten their certificate or if they were a veteran educator. So this new law breaks down those barriers for out-of-state educators and counselors who have at least 3 years of successful teaching experience in their state. They can come teach in Michigan schools without having to take another test. So we were happy to see this law pass, as this really recognizes the professionalism and success of all teachers, regardless of what state they start out in. All right, so finally, looking ahead, to end my presentation today, I just want to flag that we do have some exciting legislation on the horizon. So Senate Bill 395 and 396 amend the educator evaluation laws. And we at the department are super excited to see these bills move, as there are so many great things included. Not to spoil Dan's thunder, but the reduction of rating categories from 4 to 3, rater reliability training, due process protections, and a lot of other great things that I will let Chairwoman Polehanki's Chief of Staff, Daenzer, dig into later this morning. Also, just this week, we actually saw the introduction of some bills to increase charter school transparency. So House Bill 5231 through 5234 requires the name of the authorizer and educational management organization to appear on all signage related to the school. And House Bill 5269 requires charters to post salary information on the website. So this will help teachers make informed decisions about where they want to work, as this is required in traditional public schools, but not public school academies. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done in this realm, namely around the finances of charter schools. As we saw from the FOIA request issued by the board under Dr. Albrecht, many charter schools contract with a management company for all or most services, which they can just report as purchase services, leaving no way to see what taxpayer dollars are actually buying. So we recognize there's definitely a lot more work to be done, but we are excited to see that we're getting started. This is a foot in the door for charter school transparency.
Okay.
So that is all I have for you this morning. I've included a link to the monthly newsletter for that our Office of Educator Excellence puts out and sends to in-service educators. This helps keep everyone up to date on what's going on. So I believe the PowerPoint will be shared, or you can just search. It's called Educationally Speaking online. And I just want to say thank you, not only for listening to me on this nice Saturday morning, but also for all you do for Michigan kids. And I think we have a few minutes for questions on anything that I presented here. And if you don't want to ask it here, I also included my email. Feel free to email me anytime with any questions or thoughts that you might have.
Okay, well, we do have a few minutes for questions. Thank you, Olivia. That was absolutely great. That was great.
And we do have 2 questions.
Okay, why don't you
Our first question is, are charter schools included in this?
Yes, so all charter schools, like the employees of charter schools, are still public school employees. It gets a little murky. There are some charter schools that do not collectively bargain, so that in those instances, though, those teachers wouldn't be included. So for this one, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that has more knowledge in this area, but I believe it's kind of it's going to go by charter basis.
Yeah, so Olivia, I can help with this one.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Nate Walker, as Michelle said, attorney with AFT Michigan. And so the question is, do these legislative changes broadly affect employees at charter schools? And so some of the changes will affect employees at charter schools. Those changes that are particularly done or made to the revised school code, those changes apply to public school districts in Michigan, and charter schools are considered public school districts. They have public boards by appointment, and so like the evaluation law would cover teachers and other employees in charter schools. Any changes to PARA, the Public Employment Relations Act, will likely not cover employees in charter schools. And the difference is that most charter schools contract with an educational management organization, and under the rules of labor law, the management organization is the employer of charter school employees. And PARA covers public employees in Michigan, and the educational management organizations are private companies. So charter school teachers have collective bargaining rights. Those just occur under the National Labor Relations Act, which covers the collective bargaining for private employees. And so I guess the silver lining of this is some of the things that public employees here won back, like the right to bargain over discipline and discharge and these sorts of things. Charter schools who are covered by the National Labor Relations Act always had that right. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk more about those differences down the road. But the main difference is the difference between a public and private employee.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And do the compensation changes apply to the charter schools as well and charter school employees or not?
And so, I don't know, Olivia, if you want me to go or if you want.
If we're talking about budget line item 27L, then yes, that money goes out to all of our public school districts. And as Nate pointed out, charters are public school districts as defined in the school code. So that funding will be available to charter school teachers. I don't know if you had anything to add. If we weren't talking about section 27L, and I'll leave that to Nate, but that pot of money does apply to charters.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we have 3 more questions. The next question is from Tony. It says, I have a question about the budget line items, specifically the loan repayment and educator compensation. Will districts have to apply for these grants, or is this money that districts are automatically receiving?
So that's a really good question. And it's different depending on the line item. So for 27L, the educator compensation, this $63.8 million, because that's just equal per pupil payments, that money is going out in the 1/11 state payments that schools get. So that is going out to schools automatically, and it was already included in the October state aid payment. On the other side, the student loan repayment program, because there's different, everyone has a different student loan payment. I mean, it's capped at 200, or it's the lesser of, like, if your student loan payment is not 200, because there's that provision of different districts with 85% being economically disadvantaged. That is something that schools will have to apply for. And we are still getting the application all set up for that. So we can hopefully expect to see that early next year, is in a few months, probably like 4 months from now. And that will be, all the information for that is in our weekly communication to districts. Every Thursday we send out information on all the new grants opening up. We'll have webinars and just really walking districts through how to get that money. But that one will have to be applied for. Educator compensation is already going out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And our next question is from Jacqueline in regards to retirement. The $15,000 per calendar year, does that only include earnings when you're retired in that calendar year, or a combination of retired earnings and earnings if you were employed in that calendar year?
I am like 90% sure. I'm kind of looking at Dan if he wants to correct me, but I'm pretty sure this is only post-retirement. So when you return to work, it's that $15,000 after retirement. So this does not count your earnings when you were employed with the school pre-retirement.
Correct.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much. And last question is from Eddie. When our contract expires without a new contract, do we automatically get a step increase based on the salary scale, or do we need specific language in the existing contract stating that we do?
That's actually something that Nate and I will speak to. It's coming up a little later in the presentation.
Excellent.
Sit tight, Eddie.
Perfect.
We'll make
Thank you
sure
so
we get there for you.
Yeah. Yes, my dear. He's my husband, by the way. Like sweet husband. He always asks tough questions. Thank you, Olivia. That was fantastic. We will be making that PowerPoint available to all of you. Rory, you said you're going to send it out via email?
Yes, I can send it out via email.
Okay, so we'll make sure everyone who has their email here will get it to you. Now, I'm a little nervous. Is Representative Weiss in the room? That's what I was afraid of. Okay, obviously she's delayed, but why don't we just have a little switch of and start with Dan? Do you want to start with some of the things that your office is working on and speak to that right now?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. It's hard to follow Olivia because she's so good at the policy and is just so articulate. So I will try to follow that up, but she's a hard person to follow. So I work for Senator Dayna Polehanki. I'm her chief of staff. I also staff the Senate Education Committee, and she is chairwoman of the Senate Education Committee. She is the vice chair of the K-12 approach subcommittee, pre-K-12 approach subcommittee, which is the money, school aid money. And she was a teacher for 19 years. So she was a teacher, secondary teacher in New Haven High School. So she's very sympathetic, very knowledgeable about what's going on in the classroom. And so we started the new year. We were definitely hopeful that we would win a majority back in our chamber. And we kind of thought the House would be a little bit of a long shot. But election night, we saw that both chambers flipped. We retained the governor's office. So now all of a sudden, our imaginations were able to run a little more wild than we had anticipated. So things were very exciting. And we started kind of thinking about what we wanted to do as an office. And we really wanted to do policy that empowered teachers, districts, people at a local level. And I think you will see that over and over. We also really seen the war on teachers that happened here in Michigan, really from 2021 through 2016, especially under the Snyder administration. There were policies in place that were put in place that have not been effective in our opinions. So we went to work with kind of the notion of, let's see what we can do to give some power back to districts, give some power back to employees, and really make the education profession something that people will hopefully want to go back into again. So for us, there were a number of things that right off the bat, Olivia mentioned the third grade reading bill. That was Senator Polehanki's bill. That was something that was timely because every year we have this issue where students have to get retained. And Olivia mentioned about immediate effect. Well, almost everything we passed out of our committee in the Senate, we need 2/3 votes on, and the other side of the aisle is not very apt to give us those 2/3 votes. So that, especially because we wanted those kids this fall, or this spring rather, coming up, to not have to go through that process, those schools to have to go through that process. That was something we addressed right off the bat because we knew it wouldn't get immediate effect. That kind of, it's very rare when we do get immediate effect on things. And so that was something we were really excited about. We had some changes to para. Obviously, that did not go through our committee, went through labor. But my boss is very supportive of that. One of the bills actually did come through our committee, and it was the one that Olivia talked about, that was Representative Skaggs' bill, which had some seniority issues, but for the most part, that went through Labor Committee. Now, The big thing that we've been working on as far as teachers are concerned, our bill particular is 395, which has most of the evaluation changes. Early on, we knew that this would be a big project. There's a lot there. There's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people with opinions on this, right? School management folks. There's some things in there that they really like. There's some things in there that they're not too fond of. We worked really closely hand in hand with our friends at MEA and AFT. If you look at these bills, their fingerprints are all over them because they worked with us from the beginning to the end, finding things that will make life easier for teachers and administrators in these bills. So what are they? Well, I think the first thing, and the thing that really has just been something that drives us absolutely crazy, is the M-step in student growth. I don't need to tell anyone in this meeting why that's just ludicrous. We're measuring teachers' growth on students that aren't their students. So ultimately, my boss in the original version of the bill had no student growth at all required. And she, I think, ultimately feels that student growth is tricky, and ultimately, a lot of this has to do with the circumstances that our teachers are in, the districts, the circumstances of their students. But ultimately, we have decided there was an amendment in the House that set it at 20% student growth, which will be locally negotiated. So the M-step's gone. We are excited that student growth is reduced, and it will not be tied to the M-step scores. Rating categories, we changed it from 4 to 3. Highly effective is gone. The new rating categories are going to be effective, developing, and need support. And along those categories, there's a couple changes. If you are working with our labor partners, if someone is developing, it gets a developing category. We have put them on an IEP, not as something that's a punishment, but as something that will help them get to that effective category. We also assign those people mentors. The district has got to give them mentors so that they can have some guidance as to pulling out of that developing category. So categories, student growth, there is really no due process in these evaluations. And a lot of times teachers will get through, they'll get the 3 ineffective, right now it's ineffective evaluations in a row, and then they are dismissed. Then they have to go through the tenure process and fight things when it's all essentially said and done. That was disturbing to Senator Polehanki, a lot of teachers. She has seen firsthand. She was a union representative. When she was a union representative that year, she had her only evaluation that was not exceptionally good, and she felt targeted. We've heard from other folks that this can be a situation. We know, I've seen firsthand people being targeted. So in the second evaluation, that what's going to be called need support, there's an arbitration piece in there that we are pretty excited about because it does provide that due process. So folks will go to an arbitrator and we'll have the opportunity to have that evaluation either confirmed or thrown out. We added a category of not evaluated, and that is essentially for folks who have some very strange circumstances. Maybe they're out for most of the year. That's the most likely outcome. But if someone is there less than, I think we said 60 days, there's no way to really effectively evaluate them. So the last thing is we changed the frequency of evaluations. So if you are a teacher and you get 3 effective evaluations in a row, you can go on a bi or triennial schedule of evaluations. We know that administrators are spending a lot of time with folks who don't need support when there are people who need more support. It is burdensome. I think that just the constant pressures on teachers wears people down. And so we're excited to see that. So talking about the rating category that I had just mentioned before, then if you are, let's say, effective 3 years in a row, and then you have a rating of not evaluated, you're on medical leave or whatever the case may be, that does not break your streak. Same thing if you are the needs support category. If you receive a couple of needs support in a row, then you are not evaluated. That does not break the streak either way. So that was just something interesting to know. So there are a lot of like smaller things in these bills that we think are important. Those are the large things that really stand out. I think those are the things that people really wanted to see when we had conversations with them. We've done some other things like in kindergarten, instead of 30 days, we expanded it in the beginning of the year that you have to do your testing. We expanded it to 90 days. There are things like that throughout the bill that are minor things, but we've heard from folks that those things are helpful. I have one other piece of legislation that I want to touch on that is up in committee right now for us. It's actually getting a vote on Tuesday. It's 50221. It's House Bill Colazar. What this does is essentially when someone joins the profession, they have that option. Right now they are opted into the 401k program. And unless they opt into the pension program, they will get that 401k. There are folks who, especially when you're starting a teaching career, you have a lot on your plate. I'm a former teacher. I get that. And they're not always looking at the retirement, especially when you're a younger person. We see that people are regretting that they had not taken a closer look at that, wanted to be in the pension system, and then it's too late. You cannot change. So what we're doing is we're changing it so that you will have to opt out of the pension system instead of opt in. That I think will give our teachers a bit more of security in their retirement and fix the issues of people who essentially have some remorse that they didn't know exactly that they had to opt in or opt out. Looking forward, I think, we had a aggressive agenda. We did the 3rd grade reading. We had a bill to, again, this is kind of like empowering local districts. We had a bill that expand the use of sinking funds to transportation. And for us, again, it's if schools don't have to spend those general fund dollars on transportation, they can use it on things like salaries. They can use it on putting resources right in the classrooms. So again, empowering local districts, empowering local people. those so ultimately we have had a pretty busy agenda. We are pretty excited about what's ahead. We have passed out of our committee a bill that makes the free school meals permanent. It's currently on the Senate floor. And then, I think there's Representative Colzar did a nice job of introducing a couple of charter things. I think there'll probably be more conversations about charters. Exactly what that looks like, I don't know, but I think especially around financial transparency with EMOs and things like that, I think we have some real concerns. So we have also another thing I think will be on the agenda when we come back is dyslexia legislation. It looks a little bit different this year than it did last session. It's meant to reduce testing, give teachers a little more flexibility than there was before. But it's definitely something that we hear a lot from parents. We hear a lot at coffee hours, folks that are, it's definitely something that there's a grassroots push for. So if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Sorry you've had to look at my face all morning instead of a PowerPoint like Olivia had, but I figured it would be a little bit easier for me to just kind of chat through the things we've been working on.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
We
thank you.
do have questions.
Oh, no, wait, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go
It's
ahead.
okay, because we could do questions now, but we have Rep. Weiss online. So Representative Weiss, thank you for joining. So we've just covered, Dan has talked about some of the bills that are pending and coming out of the Senate. So we just wanted to hand it over to you to talk about some of the bills that you have been working on or that have been passed that you think teachers should focus on, or not just teachers, but all public school educators should be focusing on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the bills that we got passed this year, right before we went into in-district work period for the summer at the end of June, that I think is a major win for teachers and that everyone should know about, particularly when they're heading to the bargaining table, is reform to PARA, or Public Employees Relation Act. And so back in 2012, that era that we all know is not great for public education in the state of Michigan. One of the things that was done was there were several subjects of bargaining that became prohibited subjects of bargaining for teachers. And we really wanted to, and like my focus, it was honestly one of the main reasons why I ran for the position that I'm in, is restoring some of these collective bargaining rights, because I've seen in my classroom how some of these have been abused and the impact that that's had on children. So we actually had a lot of pushback, and it was very, very difficult to get it done. For those of you who don't know, we have 56 House Dems. We need 56 votes to get anything passed in the House. And so we have literally no room for error when it comes to anything that is going to be on a party line. And this was very much a party line issue. And so we had a lot of pushback from particularly superintendents and superintendent groups, and also some school board members as well, who were calling our members and really pushing back and trying to stop this from happening. Had to do a ton of education and a ton of work in order to really stress to our members the importance of this legislation, why it was important to restore these prohibited subjects of bargaining, what things were like before they went away, what's happened since. We had 2 days of testimony in the House Labor Committee, and ultimately we were able to get it across the finish line in both the House and the Senate. But it was a much bigger lift than I had anticipated it would be. But we heard in that testimony stories from teachers from across the state about how a lot of these issues have impacted their classroom. The main issue that was up for debate was around teacher placement. And so that was where we got the most pushback. And it was also where we heard from teachers was the biggest impact, for many of them, the biggest impact that has happened since it was taken off the bargaining table. So again, we heard about things like, from retaliation to just bad decision-making. There was one story someone told that I was particularly horrified about, that a teacher, an elementary teacher who had previously only taught upper elementary, was put in a kindergarten classroom because her administrator said she looked like a kindergarten teacher. Things like that. I shared my own story about how after count day, we had declining enrollment and we lost a teacher and everyone's schedules got shuffled around. I had a brand new class added to my roster that I had a weekend to prepare for that I'd never taught before. Brand new kids. We had kids whose schedules, all our students' schedules were changed. Classes were canceled. I had kids crying in my room about their honors English class being canceled because we didn't have the capacity to be able to offer it anymore. And we didn't have any, at that point, I didn't really know about this. And I went and talked to my union and I was told, yeah, no, there's nothing we can do about it because placement is a prohibited section of bargaining. So there's literally nothing you can do, nothing that we can do. It just is what it is. And so I'm excited that we are able to get this through and across the finish line. And I'm really hopeful that that unions and administrators will work together to really bring out best practices when it comes to things like teacher placement and a lot of the other prohibited subjects of bargaining that were restored, and that you can use that in order to make improvements that will benefit students and benefit your schools, and also hopefully will help to lead to stronger contracts overall. So that was one of the biggest ones. I don't know if, and I apologize because I came on a little late. Dan, did you talk at all about some of the charter school bills that are being worked on in the House right now? Or
I touched on those a little bit, but I know you're one of the sponsors of one of those. So if you want to go into more detail, I just kind of mentioned briefly what they do, but that we're kind of looking ahead to more financial transparency, hopefully in the future.
Yeah. Okay. So if you touched on it already, that's all right. But we do have those. Those are up in the House this week. So I just wanted to mention those briefly. It is very much like tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that needs to be done in that space, but it's just some basic transparency around signage is what we're working on right now. Charter school law is very complicated. It touches a lot of different parts of statute. And so it's just taken a really long time to get a lot of drafts back. So hopefully when we're looking into the new year, we'll have a lot more legislation that we'll be working on there. And then I also just wanted to mention too that a couple other things that we were able to get across the finish line I think are really going to be impactful for schools and for teachers. One was the third grade reading retention reform, and that was through ed policy. So we were able to remove that automatic retention requirement at the third grade level. We understand and recognize that a lot of the third grade reading law intention was good, providing additional resources, trying to make sure that that districts and teachers have what they need to be able to help improve literacy up through and beyond the third grade is really critical. But that automatic retention piece that was hanging over everyone's heads just made everything a lot more challenging. And we know, and we had plenty of statistics and data that doing an automatic retention doesn't actually do anything to help improve literacy or serve kids. And so we were able to remove that automatic retention piece. And then we also eliminated the A through F system in Michigan. It was duplicative. We already have the federal system that we use for evaluating schools. And it really seemed like the intention of the A through F was to be more punitive for school districts. And what we really want to focus on in the legislature is doing what we can to support teachers, to support districts in order to serve students, and where they're coming up short, trying to provide resources and support to be able to get them there, as opposed to just giving them a quote unquote report card to make them look bad and demoralize the teachers in those buildings. So those are some of the things that we were able to get across the finish line right away. Still a lot more in the pipeline that we're working on. And I'm hopeful that we can get more done at the start of the year. And hopefully get a couple of these charter school pieces across the finish line before the end of the year.
Thank you, Regina. Rep Weiss. I appreciate that. And thank you, Dan. So now we're going to open it up for questions. I know that there's some questions in the Q&A, and I also see some in the chat. Rory, did you want to
Yes.
help with that?
I am happy. So the first question is for Dan, and it is from Tony. And Tony was wondering, what will count as student growth? Can we use attendance?
So it's a good question. We didn't specifically address attendance. It says, I'm trying to think of the actual bill language here. It says objectionable things that are objectively measurable. So that maybe that can be a portion of it. Basically, though, it's locally bargained. We didn't put a lot of limitations on it. So that's something that you all can work out in your collective bargaining agreements.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And from Chris asks, when the 20% is locally negotiated, is the percentage negotiable, less than 20%, or is it the 20% set? If it is set, what can be negotiated?
Yeah, so basically the source of what you are going to use as student data can be negotiated. We had, when it passed out of the Senate, it was up to 20%. We had to make an amendment in the House because we wanted the bill to get signed and by the executive office. So ultimately we made the floor and the ceiling 20%. But whether it's local assessments, whether it's iReady or your benchmark testing or whatever folks decide to use on a local level when negotiated, that's what essentially you will be negotiating locally.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. From Nancy, can you explain when a teacher will be evaluated again after the 3 effectives in a row, please?
Yeah, so the language says biannual or triennial. Again, that's something that can be decided locally. But I think a lot of our administrative groups, just talking about to them, are more than happy if someone's effective, to do triennial evaluations. They do not have a problem with that. I think they we'll see. There may be districts that feel differently, but so that gives you a couple of years of reprieve from that microscope. So here's the one thing to know, though, is if you are evaluated again, and let's say you get needs support or developing, the cycle starts over again. So if you get that effective evaluation, then you can stay on that triennial. But if someone slips as far as their rating goes, then the cycle begins again.
Awesome. Thank you. And then would HB 5021 allow those teachers who were defaulted to the non-pension program go back and change the selection?
No, we wish that they could, but it's from my understanding, the way the law was written and technicalities with the pension system and things like that, it does not create a remedy that creates some issues with the retirement system and other things that would have made this a lot more difficult. So Representative Kolazar wanted to get done what he could get done, and that is dealing first with the people who are the new hires, and that's a relatively easy fix. I say easy fix, but it didn't get any Republican support in the House. It probably won't in the Senate either. So, but our party is very supportive. Everyone we've talked to so far in the Senate is on board with the bill.
I'm glad to hear that. From Nancy, will funds from transportation be allowed for ISDs also? Is an ISD employee, or as an ISD employee, we often hear that funds allocated for locals do not apply to ISDs.
Yeah, this would not, well, let me think about this. Probably not, because it's specific to sinking funds. So because of that, I think sinking funds are only local. I don't think a county can have a sinking fund, as far as I understand. So those are just would be local districts.
Is that question for the transportation fund that was in the budget?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you were talking about our bill that allowed sinking fund usage on buses, then that's the answer. If you're talking about the budget, Regina's better to answer that question.
Yeah, I guess just clarification on that question, which you were talking about.
Unfortunately, I don't have clarification on the question. If I could get clarification on what specifically the ISD question was referring to.
Yeah.
Oh, it was sinking funds, yes.
I can mention too really quick. I should have, and I apologize, I forgot to mention to talk about the budget. And I can just do a quick segue there and touch on a couple of things really quick that we were able to get done in the budget, because I think the budget is really a huge piece supporting teachers. We've seen over the past 2 years, prior to years, some pretty strong budgets out of the legislature comparatively to what we had seen even 5 years ago. However, I think this year, the budget that we were able to put out with a Democratic controlled legislature and Democratic governor is the strongest budget that we've ever seen for public schools in the state. More money than ever invested into public education. And then we also tried to put money, spend money in a way that was equitable, and really try to highlight that equitable piece. And so we invested more money than ever into our at-risk fund to help students who are on free and reduced lunch, experiencing homelessness and foster care and other at-risk factors. We invested over $200 million additional dollars into that pot, which is more than we ever have. We increased the percentage reimbursement for that, and then also instituted something called the Opportunity Index in order to give even more resources and more support to districts with higher concentrations of poverty. We also did a massive increase for special education funding. So we, for the first time ever, fully funded the Special Education Foundation allowance. Prior to this year, the per pupil base level of funding that every student got, a portion of that was held back in order to pay for reimbursement for special education students. This year we did the full base level funding for everyone, and then special education reimbursement rates are on top of that full base level of funding. We also increased funding for our English language learners. We increased funding for mental health services and school safety. And we also funded for the first time ever school transportation, which is what I wasn't sure if that question was getting at. And so just really to touch on that quickly, we've never funded school transportation as a separate line item. It's always been local districts had to figure that out on their own. They pay for it primarily out of their foundation allowance. And so in districts that, particularly rural districts that have a much longer amount of time that they're having to drive to pick up students, they could be spending as much as $1,000 or more per pupil just on that transportation piece. And so we created a fund that gives a reimbursement rate back to districts. It's weighted based on the distance between pupils for pickup. So districts that have farther, basically districts that have greater costs get more reimbursement. But that's, again, first time we've ever done that. And it's going to be a huge for every district that provides transportation, but particularly for those rural districts. We also expanded our pre-K Great Start Readiness program in order to serve more students, and also expanded it up to 5 days. And we also provided, for the first time ever, free universal breakfast and lunch for all students in the state of Michigan. So those are some of the main highlights And again, I was late, so I apologize, Olivia, if you already covered some of that.
That's great. And I just want to make sure everyone knows that, you know, how instrumental you were in getting that funding budget passed. You know, you've really done a tremendous job. And so
Thank you. And then we also did one last thing. We also tried to include some things in the budget to help with teacher recruitment, particularly around recruitment, a little bit on retention, although I think there's a lot more we need to do there. So we did some included funding for student teacher stipends, for tuition forgiveness, student loan forgiveness, and we also provided funding for increased funding for Grow Your Own for the Talent Together program to help improve that pipeline of people getting into the classroom.
very good. Excellent. Thank you.
Excellent. We have 4 more questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
We'll see what we can get through.
Oh, yeah. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. From Kimberly, we have what other general fund line items besides unused transportation can be used on salaries or classroom spending?
Does anyone want to take that?
So mostly for classroom spending, you're talking about the foundation allowance in particular, and we increased that by 5% this year, and that can be used for salaries as well. We also did a couple of things that I think could help with some of the offset some costs that could be able, so districts can use more of that foundation allowance towards that. So I mentioned things like the transportation fund and other things like that, but we also had a MIPSers reimbursement this year for the first time ever. So it wasn't a lot, but it was a 0.5 percentage point MIPSers reimbursement. And that's money that districts pay directly into retirement costs that's coming out of the classroom. So any reimbursement we do that there for districts, that it can go right back into the classroom, can go back for salaries. Also, we did some work around providing funding for declining enrollment, doing a blended pupil count. So districts that are experiencing declining enrollment have a little bit more of a buffer there so that they don't lose a lot of funding suddenly if their enrollment declines, which again will help stabilize budgets moving forward and hopefully will help encourage districts to be able to spend more money. What we have been seeing is that a lot of districts across the state have a little bit of an inflated budgets right now. They're kind of like a balance on their budgets. They're sort of holding back spending because I think the concern is around what's going to happen at the state level. Is there going to be a cliff, especially with a lot of these federal dollars that are coming off the books, both for local districts and at the state level? We've tried to be really intentional in the budget to make sure that we are only funding things with ongoing dollars that districts will need to have ongoing in order for there to not be that cliff. And so I'm hopeful that as we get into the next budget and things kind of settle into more of a normalcy, that districts will feel more comfortable increasing some of that spending. Because I think right now, in just talking to some superintendents, there is a fear that there may be potentially a cliff coming, but we don't really see that right now at the state level. And hopefully another strong budget next year will prove that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Representative Weiss. We have a question specifically for Dan from Eddie. Will there be a window for those remorseful teachers who missed the window to join the pension plan to get a new opportunity to join?
Unfortunately, no, at this point with this legislation.
I can add on to that really quick. I had a conversation with Treasury about that because I think that there is a desire to be able to do that. It is very complicated, and a lot of it has to do with the IRS and federal requirements. And so Treasury is looking into it further, trying to get further guidance from the IRS, but at this point, they don't know that it's even possible to be able to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then we have a question for whoever from Jeff, which is, What the legislators have achieved in their limited time is amazing. Thank you. Behaviors and disrespect is a huge issue in schools and classroom. It is a top reason cited as to why some educators leave the profession. What, if anything, can be done on this topic? I do understand that this is a complicated and layered area. And he continues, I have a whole speech on this and have written a whole article on this topic and have been for years and years. It keeps getting swept under the rug.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's definitely hard to legislate behavior. So, you know, what we can do, I think, is try to make conditions so that our teachers, that teaching's a profession, again, that people want to go into, that it is a place, it is a desirable profession. You know, we're definitely, if there are suggestions there that people have about specific education, we're always happy to hear it. It is, especially during the pandemic, some of the stories that our educators had to endure and just are so troubling. This is, we would argue, there's been the assaults on teachers has created some of these conditions where people just walk all over them. And, you know, that is something that definitely needs to change. Legislatively, I think it's difficult, but again, we're happy to hear any suggestions.
I just want to add that it keeps being mentioned that it's teachers, it's school staff, parapros are being disrespected. So I just would ask that going forward, if we could say educators and school staff. It's just, as a para, it's very hard to continuously hear we're being left out of the conversation. Sorry.
No. Yeah, definitely. Certainly all of our school staff, you know, we have a lot of folks, I know paras, our bus drivers probably have the hardest job, in my opinion. As a teacher, I would, you know, look at those folks and go, you couldn't pay me enough to do that job. So obviously there are people outside of the teachers who do amazing work, and so I apologize.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I just had a conversation yesterday about this, particularly around staff safety and any legislation that can support that. And so we are looking at some ideas to be able to address some of those issues. And I think some of it, like conversations that I have, also lead into the charter school space, and again, having like transparency there in terms of reporting on issues that occur with students. It seems like, and what we've heard a lot is that, you know, and you probably have seen a lot of this, where unfortunately there are some charters that will enroll students and then, you know, following count day will ask them to leave and then not give any context for why. And the local district picks that up, and it's a problem. And that's something that we're looking at for several reasons. Obviously, it's a funding issue, but it's also can potentially be a safety issue. So we're looking into addressing that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think we made it to the last question. It was, let's see. Please let me know how we can be helpful with charter school legislation, particularly regarding financial transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. Representative Colazar is really taking the lead on a lot of the charter school piece, but we are working closely with his office on it. There was a large number of bills that were requested that are still kind of in the works. And so you can always, I'll put my email in the chat. If anyone has ideas or things that they want to share, you can always reach out directly to my office, or you can reach out to Rep Colazar's office, or to Dan and Rep Polehanki's office, because we're all kind of working on this issue together.
Yeah, and just along those lines, I think there's 14 bills that are in development that haven't been introduced yet. So there's more to come, I imagine.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you so much. This was very enlightening to me and just really dense, good information. And again, this is going to be posted on our website along with the PowerPoint like next week. So if anyone wants access to the PowerPoint or that, just I will put our website link into the chat in a minute. And the Q&A should go, the questions should go into the Q&A, not the chat, but I'm gonna put the link to our website in the chat. So anyway, I thank you again, Dan and Rep. Weiss. It was really great to have your insight here. And I know that Representative, you have to run, and Dan, if you can stay if we have questions in the next section, that's if you're able to. I know you're a busy person too. But the next section, we have Nate Walker from the AFT Michigan, as well as Tammy Daenzer from MEA. So I'm really pleased we have people from both of our major unions representing public school employees. And I'm so sorry, Jeff. I should be more inclusive because I know how important parapros are. So yeah, and many school staff, not just teachers. So that's everybody makes it work. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Nate Walker and to Tammy.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here. We did put together a PowerPoint presentation to share with you. I'm going to try and figure out how to share it now. But a lot of the things that are in our PowerPoint have already been discussed, and so we'll just kind of gloss over some of those. But we do want to get more in depth in terms of what you can actually accomplish at your bargaining table relative to the laws that have recently been passed.
You hit the green share screen at the bottom. You see it?
I do, but for some reason it's not showing me the presentation.
Let me go to your name and see if I can.
While they're pulling up the slides, let me just add that as Jeff mentioned, that we know that school districts employ all sorts of different types of employees. During some of our discussion around bargaining subjects, there's going to be some teacher-centric discussion, and that's just because the law that prohibited subjects of bargaining in 2011 were aimed specifically at teachers for some topics. And so we'll make sure we emphasize which of these changes apply to teachers, because they now provide teachers with new rights, and the implication there for folks who are in bargaining units that don't represent teachers is that most of these rights are rights that you maintained during the previous changes to prohibited subjects. And so I just want to clarify that if you hear us use the term teachers, sometimes it's really with purpose regarding the law.
Can you guys see the screen now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So this is really what Nate and I are going to speak to, is in terms of what victories we've seen, what's been won, what the impact is, and what is going to come in the future. And I just want to point out that none of these victories would be possible without the historic wins that we had in the last election. Putting pro-public education majorities in both the House and the Senate, that's the first time that has occurred in the last 40 years. Retaining majorities on the State Board of Education, as well as the big wins that we had in ballot measures and in local school board races. Those are the things that have really allowed us to get to where we are today. Anytime educators make sure that their voice is heard, whether that's at the state and local level, or if that's, in terms of putting individuals in office, those are the things that really matter. And so in the next upcoming election, I just want to really stress how important it is for people to get out and vote. We have some wonderful Michigan teachers that didn't feel like the voice was being heard in the legislature that ran for office. and that are now serving on a variety of very important committees, and often the chairs of those committees. And thank you, absolutely thank you, Representative Weiss, for being here today, because she is the chair of the Appropriations Committee, and that has been huge for us. Dan, of course, is the Chief of Staff for Senator Polehanki. Representative Kolizar has put forth a lot of legislation that's very important for us, and State Senator Camilleri as well. There's been a lot of wins that we've had, many of which have already been spoken to, so we won't spend a lot of time going over that. But I do want to spend a little bit of time just stressing the importance of the education budget. It allocated $9,608 per student, which is $458 more than last year. This is the biggest investment in students in our state's history. We've never seen these type of investments in our public school system. $160 million invested to ensure that our public school students receive that free breakfast and lunch that was talked about a little bit earlier. We've already covered that additional funding in terms of public transportation and the increases in at-risk English language learners and special education. Some of those funds, there was a question about that earlier, some of those funds are able to be allocated to ISDs. We did talk about those bills that received immediate effect that will help us to retain current educators as well as attract more educators to the profession. I want to say also that does extend into counselors. We want to be sure that we have enough certified state counseling individuals that can support our students. There's a big push to ensure that all students do complete the FAFSA before they leave so that they know what their opportunities are in terms of next steps after graduation. And we won't be able to make that effective transition without enough counselors to be able to support that. And as we get into some of these other bills, I'm going to defer to Nate to interject on any of these that are implications of bargaining. So the first one that we want to focus on is House Bill 4044 that was sponsored by Representative Kolizar. That's the one that eliminates those penalties on public school employees when contracts expired. There was a question about that earlier. The bargaining is not going to automatically advance your step if you don't have language in your contract that speaks to that. And so it's very important that you do in your next bargain draft language that says that those steps will be automatic at the end of the year or automatic at the beginning of the year, or however you want to arrange that. But your contract language does have to speak to that advancement in order for it to take place. Same thing with your employer contributions to insurance. You want to make sure that those caps automatically adjust, or that you're bargaining, whatever that investment in your insurance is going to look like.
The piece that I'll add here, and this maybe speaks to Eddie's question, which I know Tammy just I think hit directly. The section of para that prohibited the advancements of step placements or pushed the cost of continuing insurance benefits onto employees was really deadly when our bargaining units did not negotiate a successor agreement before the expiration date of the previous contract. And so there was this, in some instances, this meant a 1 to 3 month period where the compensation and benefits were frozen, and in the worst case scenario, the benefits were pushed off onto our employees, and we couldn't negotiate a retroactive provision to make our members whole. Prior to this law, if it took us a little bit longer to settle a contract, we could negotiate a term or condition in the new contract that said, apply the step increase retroactively. Right. And so we can do that now. And so if we're in instances where we're negotiating an expired contract, we don't necessarily have to hide the compensation increase through a signing bonus or other things that we figured out as creative ways of dealing with this issue in the past 10 years. And so that's where the real impact of this change will be. And it's a very helpful change for us.
Sorry, Nate, I didn't mean to advance there in the middle of your.
Oh, yeah.
hit the wrong button. I don't know how you want to handle the questions. Do you want to take questions on each of these as we go through, or do you want to wait until the end? I feel like it's a lot of information, and so it might be easier to divide it out by subject.
Well, people are free to ask questions in the Q&A. As they come up, as they come into their brains, and then we can have you go through. I just want to make sure you have time to go through everything that you have, and then we can go back to the Q&A once you're done with the presentation.
Sure, no problem. Another one that is going to take place after the 91st day of the legislature adjourning is House Bill 4233. That was sponsored by Representative Jamie Churches, and that's the one that allows union members to have their dues deducted from their paycheck. That also is something that you will have to locally bargain as to how and when you want to implement that.
So to also tack on to the dues deduction piece that Tammy just mentioned, and this is a high level takeaway for all of these subjects that were previously prohibited subjects of bargaining. These provisions do not fall into your contract because the legislation changed. So if you either don't have a dues deduction provision that's waiting on trigger language, right? Or you don't negotiate a new one, there's no obligation for the employer to do dues deduction. And that's going to be the same for any of these bargaining subjects that we're talking about next. So the most important thing I'd say for local leaders here is to take a look at your current contracts, because how each local handled these issues was different when the laws became prohibited. And so use your contract as a starting place to decide, to see if there's trigger language in there, if it's silent on dues deduction, or if this is something you're going to have to make a fresh proposal on.
Okay, good.
The one that Representative Regina Weiss was our champion behind, and that she spoke to a little bit earlier, is House Bill 4354. That's the one that stripped all of those prohibitive subjects out of the Public Employment Relations Act. This is really huge win for us and opens up our opportunity to bargain in a lot of different realms. The important thing to note is that we realize that a lot of our bargainers, a lot of our members, a lot of our local leaders weren't even around in the education system prior to these topics being prohibitive subjects of bargaining. So they might not have, those that are on the call today might not have the experience of being in education before these things were taken away from us. And so it's really important that you do your due diligence and that you talk with people that were here, or go back and look at past contracts, or see what types of provisions might be available to you. I know that both MEA and AFT are working on providing some types of prototype language that our bargainers might be able to utilize to get them started at the bargaining table. But this was a huge win for us. Being able to put placement language back in the hands of our local bargainers, talking about those personnel decisions, the teacher evaluation, that being able to be bargainable, and your arbitrary and capricious versus just cause, what you want to use for your standard of discipline and why that's important. Those are really big pieces of that law.
So I'm going to make a couple of quick points about placement language, personnel decisions, and then about evaluations and about discipline and discharge, just as bargaining subjects. So the first is there were two pieces of para that were prohibited in 2011 regarding what I'll broadly describe as staffing decisions. The first dealt with teacher placement. And teacher placement deals with this idea of assigning, reassigning, or transferring teachers to different positions within a district. This is one of those where I'm using the term teachers because the statute was written specifically to reference the Teacher Tenure Act and those covered by the Teacher Tenure Act. So what that means from a bargaining context is that means anytime there's a vacancy, you could negotiate contract language of how that vacancy should be filled. Because filling a vacancy implies the assignment, reassignment, or transfer of an existing employee. So that's one sort of scope of decisions that we'd be looking at. The other are decisions that deal directly with staffing decisions, that deal with staff reductions, and personnel decisions around those staff reduction decisions. So in this context, I want you to think of layoff. Now, one point I want to make to folks that's pretty important is that it's an inherent management right to decide the staffing level and decide whether or not a layoff needs to occur, right? So you can't bargain that there, you can't bargain that there will always be 40 teachers employed in my school district no matter what. There's an inherent management right that management has the right to set the staffing level, and therefore that's a decision that they get to make as managers. But what you can bargain is essentially the impact of that staffing level decision and the personnel decisions that stem from reducing a staffing position. And so I just want to clarify that point, because this is a question that we get quite a bit, is there's about to be a layoff. Can management just make a layoff? And the answer is yes, they can decide that a layoff has to happen, but we get to bargain the implications of the staffing decisions around that layoff. So then the next one I'm going to talk about, let me make one more point about placement language. As Olivia mentioned, there was a provision in the school code that intends to set some parameters that I am sure the districts that we're bargaining with will point to. And they'll say there's language in the school code that says that teacher, what essentially amounts to seniority, cannot be the sole factor in making personnel decisions around reduction in staff and placement. And this is me talking as a union lawyer, so all respect in the world to Olivia. But the language of the statute is much broader than seniority can be used as the tiebreaker. The language says seniority cannot be the sole factor. Seniority could be the predominant factor. Seniority can have a lot of weight here. It just can't be the sole factor. The other part of that that provision of the school code says that these types of decisions also have to consider what will amount to being the decisions made under the evaluation legislation. So essentially, evaluation ranking has to be a factor. And so I just want to make sure that folks understand that while there is a limitation on how seniority can be used in placement decisions, we still recommend that if that's a direction your union wants to go, just so long as it is not the only factor that you use, feel free to bargain a strong seniority provision in these decisions. And so then the next one was evaluation, and there's a lot of discussion here around evaluation. Know that the school code is going to set parameters, but under para, there is no prohibition on being able to bargain teacher evaluations. Now, I'm going to say that whatever the outcome of the evaluation bill becomes, school districts are going to point to that as a compass, and they're going to talk about how that has to be controlling in all collective bargaining agreements in language. And while we certainly don't want to put the district in a position where they're not complying with the revised school code, also know that evaluation is a mandatory subject, and there's some strong opinions that para is a preemptive law. And so know that you have strong bargaining rights around evaluation. And unless there's a prohibition in para, even some of these subjects that we get into, we really have a lot of latitude to bargain those. And then the final one on the slide, which I want to draw folks' attention to, is arbitrary, capricious versus just cause standards of discipline. So the first thing is know that discipline in general was considered a prohibited subject of bargaining previously. And so that meant processes, that meant anything that sort of determined how a district made a discipline decision. as well as the standard, which is the arbitrary and capricious versus just cause standard. We can bargain discipline entirely now. And so it's not just about movement from a just cause standard to an arbitrary capricious standard. We essentially can have a great deal of latitude to bargain any aspect of the discipline decision. Now, the most important thing you get into your contract, and it can be simple, is a just cause provision. And so your contract would be in much better shape if after all of this, you just had one sentence that said, no employee shall be disciplined unless for a reasonable and just cause, period. That would change the game for how discipline and discharge happened in your district. Of course, you'd be free to negotiate a more robust provision, but now this is a game changer. And so if work with your respective union to make sure that that you are adding a just cause provision. The only other piece I want to make on any of these issues, but specifically discipline and discharge, is remember how I said start with looking at your contract? There were some sneaky they're not sneaky, there were some management attorneys who were doing their job. And one thing that they did when they were negotiating these with us is they put in provisions in contracts that limited the scope of arbitrability, even though that was already decided in the law. So let me give you an example. Some of our locals have contracts that say no discipline and discharge decision shall have access to the arbitration provision of the grievance procedure. And unless you get that out of your contract when you negotiate your next contract, or you negotiate away with your employer is going to have the ability to keep these types of decisions from going to arbitration. So just please, please, please don't negotiate a just cause standard and forget about a provision somewhere else in your contract that keeps you from going to arbitration on this issue. And I guess I'll pause there and we can move to the next.
Well, so I kind of flipped ahead a little bit and then came back as you were talking, because I just want to point out that House Bill 4820 is that companion bill that takes care of teacher placement within the revised school code. And that does very specifically say that it has to have a transparent procedure for filling vacancies and conducting staffing recalls. And so, yes, this is a double layer of protection, if you will, that it's in both para as well as in the school code, that those transparent procedures are there and that you have the ability to bargain over them. To move us ahead, I want to talk a little bit about House Bill 4356 that was sponsored by Representative Brenda Carter. That is the one that specifically removes the restrictions on collective bargaining over non-instructional support staff services. So this is where we are going to ensure our ability to bargain over any type of subcontracting of our bargaining unit work.
And so what this could look like, and I know as Tammy mentioned, both the MEA and AFT Michigan are working on providing bargaining support for our locals on these issues. This could look like a simple no subcontracting clause moving forward. And so that would prevent the district from doing any future subcontracting. This could also look like a provision that if a district has already subcontracted for non-instructional services, we may want to consider negotiating a provision that says when that contract with the subcontractor expires, it triggers an obligation to bargain re-upping that contract. And so for some of our folks, I'm happy to talk more about those potential strategies down the road.
And that brings us to the end of our PowerPoint presentation. We just wanted to kind of spend, I know that we're getting to the end of our time together. We wanted to spend a little bit of time with you just talking about how you might prepare to go to the bargaining table when it was appropriate for you to do so and what type of provisions you might want to have, as well as any questions or do more of a question and answer session with you as well. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Currently, we only have one question from Jason, and it is, with payroll dues deduction, the school district has access to membership percentages. Is there a risk associated with districts having firsthand knowledge of those percentages?
Well, I think that you want to be cautious. If you have a low membership, you don't want to share that information with administration and say, like, we really don't have a strong buy-in into our local association. So you can bargain a variety of different ways there. You could bargain that it's an option for folks to have payroll dues deduction. You don't have to have it as a mandate that folks have the option of using dues to their paycheck to have their dues deducted. That might be one way to not send up those red flags that we're having problems in membership.
Yeah, so I can add to that as well. So getting dues. So this is directly to what Tammy just mentioned. Getting a dues deduction clause in your contract does not mean that your members have to, or that you as a union have to collect dues solely through that provision. What it does do is it gives you a contract right to have the employer collect dues through that method. So you could all, and to get at the heart of your question, Jason, you could, if it was helpful, you could put a throwaway provision in your contract that said, both parties acknowledge that the union may collect dues in other ways, right? That provision has no meaning because we have that right regardless of whether or not it's in a collective bargaining agreement. But it could, like Tammy said, signal to the employer that don't put much weight to the number that you're deducting dues from. I think more importantly to your question is, I know that some of our locals are aware that if a union falls below a majority status, that a employer can question the whether or not the union has the representation right of the bargaining unit. And there's some good case law that says number of dues paying members alone is not enough to refuse to bargain with a existing union. And so your union is going to be in much better shape if you work hard to build your membership. We all know that. But the risk, I guess I think it's a discussion that you all should have, whether or not the risk of losing representation, which I think is minimal based on using a dues deduction system, is worth the advantage of the district processing the dues for your local, which takes a huge administrative burden off of the union.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nate. And we have 3 questions left. Or excuse me, 2 questions. Next is from Tony. Does non-instructional staff include special service providers, i.e. social workers?
I would say that depends on your recognition clause in your bargaining agreements. If your teacher's recognition clause includes things like social workers, counselors as ancillary staff, then they would automatically be included in that bargaining agreement and not subject to being subcontracted. I know a lot of districts that use ISD workers, and so in the past you haven't been able to bargain over the use of those types of workers. This does allow you to bargain over that as well. So in those instances, this might apply. This is primarily geared towards our support staff, our paraprofessionals, our secretaries, our bus drivers, those types of entities, those categories of employees, to make sure that they have an ability to maintain the rights that they've collectively bargained and that they don't get outsourced without they have a voice in that process.
And Tony, I am sure that there is case law that looks at what non-instructional staff meant when it was initially included in para as a prohibited subject of bargaining. The good news is, if you think about what the change of the law is it's opening up a bargaining right to whatever was included in that definition that didn't previously exist, and other positions have had that right. So I guess to simply answer your question, I think we can assume that we don't have to worry about not being able to bargain subcontracting of social workers, because there's no prohibition of that as a bargaining subject for any other category other than non-instructional staff, and that prohibition no longer exists for non-instructional staff. I can hunt down the answer to the question you had if you want me to, but I think this is my way of saying demand to bargain, no subcontracting clauses for those positions. And if the employer says that's a prohibited subject of bargaining, we'll deal with it then, but demand to bargain.
No, I'm good, but thanks, Nate.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nate and Tammy. And then we actually have 2 more questions. Next is from Jacqueline. Just to clarify, we can't put in an opt-out of dues enrollment in payroll of our contract, correct? They have to opt in?
Yes, that is correct. There has to be a authorization. Now, AFT Michigan folks, we've been working on some guidelines and some best practices that I'm happy to talk more about at our subcommittee meeting at noon to help expedite and make this a process that maximizes our ability to rely on the district to help with this. But yes, there has to be a authorization.
Awesome. And currently, last question is, we have several bonuses that have to be earned. We want them added to our base salary. We don't want them seen as a raise. Can you comment, please?
Compensation is 100% bargainable. So I would say that that would go back to your local bargaining table to determine how you want the funds allocated.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Tammy said. Without knowing the exact situation, it's hard to really dive in, but as a starting point, this is something that's bargainable. So think of how you want to propose a fix to the problem you're experiencing and pass it across the table.
Awesome. And we got one last question from Anonymous. Is there anything on PA 152 you can share? We want to get better insurance at a lower cost to employees.
There's a number of things that we are actively brainstorming and collaborating around. One of them is PA 152 fixes. There's been no legislation introduced yet, but it's not because it isn't a conversation that we're having. We're hoping that when the legislature returns, that will be something that we can address. But exactly what that looks like, we're not 100% sure. Mostly because there's a lot of cooks in that kitchen. It isn't just educators, but there's a lot of other labor groups that are involved in that discussion as well. Same goes for more changes and enhancements to the pension system. That's an ongoing conversation as well. And look at keeping schools and classrooms safe. So we've been having a lot of conversation about what type of parameters we need to put both for outside threats as well as internal threats to make sure that our teachers and our support staff are being respected and given the ability to protect themselves while they're serving in these very important roles.
Okay. Well, it looks
If
like
we don't have any other questions, maybe Nate wants to talk a little bit about the difference between waiting till your contract expires to bargain these provisions in or issuing a demand to bargain if you have a contract that's a closed contract period. That might be something that people would be interested in knowing the difference between.
Yeah. Thank you, Tammy. I'm happy to talk about that. So know that as Tammy put in each of the slides, that while these are signed bills, specifically those PA 115, they are not effective law yet. And so the employer does not have the obligation to bargain over these with you until they do become effective law. Now, look, you know your employers, and you know that some employers, if they know what's coming, they may be willing to get into discussions about it now because that's probably beneficial for the parties. But know that they're not under an obligation to until the law is in effect. Also, you know, my high level advice is check your collective bargaining agreement and check the expiration date of that agreement. Because if your contract expires this year and you're bargaining this year, then you will likely have an opportunity to bargain contract provisions around these subjects into your successor agreement. If your contract does not expire, but you negotiated a contract that has what I'm going to call trigger language, you may have either triggered a provision that goes into effect when the law goes into effect, which would be awesome. Or you may have triggered an obligation of the employer to bargain these subjects with you. And I know we recommended that our locals bargain some of this trigger language into their contracts as they were bargaining last year. Now, if your contract is silent on the issue, and there is no trigger language, and you're under contract for 2 or 3 years, or 4 years, or your contract doesn't expire for a while, your employer may take the position that they do not have to negotiate this with you until the contract expires. The first thing you should do is, even if you don't have the trigger language, even if they don't have a obligation to bargain it with you while they're under contract, you should demand to bargain it anyway. Go to them and say, hey, look, the law's changed. We want to negotiate this. Because what's the worst thing that they can happen? They can say no. And if they say no, we can work through, we have some ideas about how to deal with that, so that we can negotiate these, try to negotiate these provisions while you're under contract. But I do think you should know that if you're under contract for a period of time, it is likely that your employer is going to take the legal position they don't have to open up these areas of the contract with you. The only thing I'll add before I sort of turn it over to Tammy for her final thoughts and then back to Michelle, is that as you know, the reason Regina talked about such a difficult time with some of our allies in Lansing over these things, and phone calls from board members and management groups, is because school districts have gotten to make these decisions on their own, unilaterally, without having to work with anyone else for 10 years. And they don't like that. They're losing power. And if you think about what a just cause provision does, is it makes sure that your members have fair and just due process rights and treatment over things like discipline and discharge. Management is not going to want to give that up easily. So I really think, just as much as thinking about the bargaining proposals you're going to make, you're going to want to think about some of the organizing strategies you can use with your members to put pressure on your districts to agree to what is a very, very important contract provision. Because many are not going to give it up easily. And I just want to prepare folks for that, because that's going to be a real likelihood.
Thank you, Nate.
I just echo that sentiment, and the fact that, like, the legislator's done a lot of work on behalf of our public educators. MEA, AFT have done a lot of work on behalf of our public educators, but the heavy lift is really going to come at your local bargaining tables. We hope that you're able to utilize these provisions that we've put back in your hands, but you really want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence and preparing for that. Because, as I said earlier, a lot of our folks, they weren't around in education before these subjects became prohibited. And so they might not understand the importance of these provisions that you want to bargain back into your contract. And so really educating your members and educating your community, and in a lot of cases, educating your Board of Education about why these are important and how they're going to improve the morale, the overall morale of your education system, and how they're going to lead to better student outcomes is going to be a really important piece of that.
Thank you. Well, I can't tell you how pleased I am with all this information, and for everybody who is coming here to use this information to help others in your workplaces. So I just can't thank you all enough. I did post the Center for Labor and Community Studies, the U of M Center, in the chat. So you could always just Google it. If you put UM Labor, I think it'll just pop up. So if you want to see the recordings in the PowerPoints, that's where they'll be sometime next week. We'll post them. And Tammy, if you would be so could share your PowerPoint, we'll make sure it gets up there. Thank you for that. I also want to make sure that Meenakshi from AFT Michigan, the AFT is continuing their leadership training for another hour. And Meenakshi, did you want to say a few words before we?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm about to drop a link in the chat. Our AFT Michigan K-12 leaders, it's also in your email, but we'll be hopping onto a separate link in just a minute.
Okay, thank you, and have a great wrap up. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of good stuff. All right, well, thank you all. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate your you know, all your wisdom and information. So thank you, and we'll see you out there.
Thank you, Michelle, for creating the space for this. This was
Sure.
really good.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. Today's been great.
Okay, wonderful. Have a good one.